Hi, and welcome to the Passionistas Project podcast. We're Amy and Nancy Harrington, and if you enjoy listening to the show, please consider becoming a patron. Just a small donation of $1 a month can help us keep the project going, and you'll get rewards like buttons, access to premium content, and invites to Passionistas Project events. Today we're talking to writer-producer Elle Johnson. In addition to her current role as executive producer on the Amazon series Bosch, Elle has worked on the TV series CSI Miami, Law & Order, Ghost Whisperer, Saving Grace, and The Glades. So please welcome to the show, Elle Johnson.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here.
What are you most passionate about?
This is going to sound bizarrely selfish, but I am most passionate about telling my stories. I have gotten to a point in my career and my life where I realized that the way I best communicate with the world and also the way I best process life is through telling stories, writing them down. I came to writing late in life, or later. I wasn't one of these people who started out as a kid and knew that I just wanted to be a writer. I had to discover that for myself. And once I discovered that that was the thing that made me happiest, I just wanted to learn how to be the best writer I could be and tell stories the best way that I could. As I've written, I've kind of realized that I'm what I would refer to as a method writer, in that I like to have an experience with something. So in order for me to write about something, I feel like if I haven't already had a personal experience with it or some involvement with it, I like to go out and get that personal experience with it and kind of use that to inform my writing. And so that's enabled me to learn about everything and anything in the world that I want to, and kind of insert myself into situations that I have no understanding of or no business being a part of, but suddenly I can learn about another part of the world. And to me, that is, I think, the thing that drives me as a writer, being able to find stories that I can make my own and tell my stories.
How do you translate that into what you do for a living?
The great thing about being a television writer is so much of writing TV is exploring other worlds. And I primarily write cop shows. My dad was a parole officer in Manhattan for 30 years. My uncles were homicide detectives. I have a lot of law enforcement in my family, and so I'm really comfortable with that world and also kind of with that character. It's a very particular personality who goes into law enforcement. I really feel like I understand that. So I generally have ended up working on cop shows. And when you do a cop show, usually what happens is you have the detectives kind of walking in and out of different worlds. Whoever the victims are, whoever the suspects are, you're usually entering their world. And that's what makes it fascinating for me, because I get to enter worlds. I get to decide, okay, this week I want to discover what's going on in the world of fashion or in the world of anthropologists or just whatever it is. And then you get to do kind of a deep dive and really explore that. And the best experience, or one of the best experiences that I had in my career, was working on a show called The Glades. And we had been approached about, or asked by the network, if we could find a way to do a story about NASCAR. And I said, I'm a black girl from Queens. I don't know anything about NASCAR. But I started to do research, and I realized it was this incredible world that in many ways was similar to being a writer or being in television, in that they worked most of the year. Like their season was, I think, 10 out of 12 months. And the intensity of it and the passion with which they approached it, I thought, okay, I kind of get what this world is. And I went to the Daytona 500 as part of my research, and NASCAR opened their doors to me. They got me a hot pass. I was in the pits. I was meeting drivers. I was in the garages all of a sudden. And I just fell in love with this world and started going to races and writing that episode. I really had to kind of have my own experience with NASCAR. And it ended up being a fantastic experience. NASCAR gave us cars to put in our show. They gave us the trucks. We shot at a homestead in Miami. We had 4 drivers in our episode. And it just ended up taking over my entire life. But it was such a wonderful experience because I really got to do a deep dive and understand that world. So much so that they invited me at the end of the year to their championship dinner and put me on panels and flew me out to Las Vegas to participate. And it was just like I was included in this family. And that's exactly the kind of experience I want to have as a writer, where you say, okay, I don't know anything about this world, but I'm going to find out about this world. And I really found out about NASCAR. It was great.
Tell us your path to becoming a writer-producer.
I really didn't know what I wanted to do after college, and the smartest thing I did through all of the mistakes that I've made was saying to myself that I needed to take time to figure out what my passion was, like what it was that I really wanted to do. So right after college, I rode a bicycle across country with a group of students called the Ride for Life, and we were raising money for Oxfam America and Save the Children. So it was during that bike ride where we biked back from San Francisco to Boston that I just kind of allowed myself to think about, what do I want to do with my life? And being on the road, on a bicycle, seeing the country, seeing the country and meeting all kinds of different people, and really just seeing how other people lived helped me to understand that I had stories that I wanted to tell. At the end of the ride, I ended up taking a job working at the American University in Cairo, an intern at the school. And my job was to write grant proposals for Egyptian students, like soliciting American companies primarily, like Raytheon, a lot of kind of defense contractors who were giving money to educate Egyptian students. And so that was kind of my first quote unquote writing job, writing those grants and proposals. And while I was in Egypt, I just started writing stories about my life in the States, like short stories. When I got back to the States, I got a job as a technical writer for a small company called Lutan Technologies that had created the computer program that allowed the Bank of Boston to track asset-backed securities. I know this sounds crazy. It was the computer program that allowed them to track their home mortgage loans or mortgage loans. And it was one of the first computer programs that did that. And it was a startup company. I mean, I didn't realize I was in a startup computer company, but I was. And I was tasked with writing the technical manual to explain to the bankers how to use the system. I was a fine arts major, so this was not in my wheelhouse at all, but I needed to use the system and figure out how to write it clearly so that people could understand. So I sort of started doing a little bit of technical writing, and while I was doing technical writing, I realized this was not the type of writing I wanted to do. I wanted to write stories and short stories. So I applied for a Rotary Scholarship to go to the University of East Anglia in England and learn creative writing. I did that for a year and started writing screenplays. And while I was in England, I was like, okay, I've tried all these different types of writing. I want to try to get into film and television. So I went back to New York, where I'm from, and managed to get a job on a television show as a script coordinator. It was my first job in television. I did not know what a script coordinator was, but they said, don't worry about it, we'll teach you what it is. And it's basically using the computer program to generate the script. So someone showed me how to do it. And all of a sudden I was surrounded by these professional television writers and working very closely with them and taking notes for them and working on the scripts and seeing how scripts come together. And I was like, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to write TV. For the reason that I saw that there was so much that you could learn every day as you're trying to write your episode. And also, unlike film, television, you have to produce a script. Like, what you write is going to be produced because they need something for air. So something's going on the air. Whether it's good or bad, you're going to have something going on the air. And I thought, this is great. It's a way to actually get your stuff made, and that was really my entree into writing for television. And when I was writing on this show, I met a writer by the name of Eric Overmyer, who became my mentor and has helped me throughout my career. He gave me my very first job in television, and he's hired me on other shows, including Bosch, where he was the showrunner. He also hired me to work on Law & Order. He got me a job on a show called Street Time that was about parole officers and parolees, which he knew was in my wheelhouse because my dad was a parole officer. So through that one job, basically, I found my mentor and kind of got my career.
And what show was that?
It was a show called The Cosby Mysteries, starring Mr. Bill Cosby as a forensic expert in the NYPD. It was a very quirky show. His character had a housekeeper who had been a dancer, and she was a very eccentric woman who never cleaned the house, and she was played by Rita Moreno. He had a sidekick who was a young African-American kid the actor's name was Dante Bize, and he left the show to become Mos Def. So it was in terms of the people who were involved with it, it was kind of incredible. And on that show were a bunch of writers also who worked on Law and Order, and it filmed in New York on Pier 62, which at that time, before it got built up into the pier that it is now, was kind of like known as a mafia dumping ground for bodies. It was just this like abandoned pier situation that has since been refurbished and is now a place where a lot of television shows shoot. But it was kind of like the 1-hour drama ghetto. Law and Order was filming out of there, and a show called Homicide was filming out of there. And Eric Overmyer, who was a writer on The Cosby Mysteries, when that show got canceled, went to work on Homicide. And I, at that time, was just trying to figure out how to actually become a working writer, make the jump from being a script coordinator to a working writer. So I'd moved out to LA, and Eric Overmyer and Tom Fontana were like, oh, okay, she's serious about becoming a writer because she actually moved out there. So Eric approached me about writing an episode of Homicide. And I was so grateful for the opportunity to do a freelance. He was doing something that at the time I didn't realize how incredible a gesture it was. He offered to split a script with me, which I now realize is taking money out of his own pocket to give me an opportunity. But at that time, Homicide was an NBC show, and it was always on the bubble. They never knew if they were going to come back or not. So he offered me this with the caveat that they didn't know if they were going to have enough episodes or not. And as it turned out, they ended up saying, we can't give you an episode because we have a writer on the show, and her grandfather was a writer, and he needed a credit to keep his health insurance, which is a situation that happens all too frequently in this business. It's so hard to have a consistent career, and sometimes you just need to do a freelance episode to keep your health insurance. And I totally understood that. So they were going to give him the episode that was supposed to go to me. His name was Julius Epstein, and if you know anything about writing, you know that he is one of the twins who wrote Casablanca. So if I had to be bumped by anybody who needed health insurance, I was like, that's totally fine, go for it. During the course of all of this happening, Jerry Seinfeld decided that he was not going to continue with Seinfeld. So he told NBC, and NBC basically panicked and picked up all of their shows, including Homicide. So all of a sudden they had more episodes. So the guys at Homicide came back to me and said, oh, we can give you an episode. You can have one. I was like, great. So I ended up writing the first part of a two-parter. It was the 99th episode. It was a big shootout in the station. And they'd also said to me they wanted to do a story in the world of parole. And so they knew that I was a parole officer's daughter and that I would have a bunch of stories. So I went through my mental file of all the stories my dad had ever told me and came up with this story, a very personal story to him that had really influenced him. There was one of the few parole officers killed in the line of duty in New York. He was gunned down in the streets by his parolee. So I kind of knew a little bit of the inside story of who they thought it was and why it had happened. And so I basically just pitched them that story, and that was the story that I ended up writing. It was my first episode of television. It was directed by Catherine Bigelow. So it was a great experience and a great way to get my feet wet in television.
So then how do you make the transition from writer to producer?
Making the transition from getting a freelance episode to staff writer is the first difficulty as well. So I was already in Los Angeles when I got this freelance episode, but I was working as a secretary at Sony Animation. And my boss was a lovely gentleman who understood that I wanted to be a writer and that this was kind of a day job for me and that I was going to get out of there at 5 and go home and start writing. I'd written this freelance episode and was in the process of just trying to get a staff job. The writer who helped me was a gentleman named Kevin Arkadai, a friend of my sister's who was in the industry. Got in touch with him and said, will you read this woman's samples and give her notes? She's trying to get into the business. And Kevin said to me later that he does this favor once a year for people. So I was his once a year favor of reading my script. He gave me notes. I didn't agree with all of the notes, but I executed all of the notes because he'd spent the time to give me notes, and I thought I want to show him that I can execute his notes. So I did his notes and gave him the script back, and he was impressed. And when he got his own show, he called me to come in and interview to be a writer, and that ended up being my first staff job on television. And he'd said to me, because I had not only taken his notes but executed them, that he knew that I could do the job because I'd already kind of proven it to him. So it was a show called Rescue 77. It was about firefighters. And it was another great experience because I knew nothing about firefighters, especially firefighters in LA. So one of the first things that they had us do was go out on ride-alongs with various fire departments, sleep over in the station houses. I mean, it was incredible in terms of doing research. And I went to a bunch of different station houses and rode with the paramedics and the firefighters. And they loved having people because, according to them, it seemed busy to me, but according to the firefighters, inevitably when you have a ride-along, nothing happens. So it was like a superstition, like, great, somebody's in the station house, so it's going to be quiet, nothing's going to happen, we'll be able to sit down and have dinner. It seemed busy to me, but to them, they're like, oh, this is great, we're not getting as many calls because you're here. But it was just kind of my entree into the power of being able to call someone up and say, hey, I'm writing a television show. Can I come and do some research? And then like the door gets open and suddenly you're invited into all kinds of people's different worlds and you can see how they do their jobs and how they live. So that was my first staff writer job, and I have been lucky enough to have worked every year since then. I've always had either a job on staff or have managed to sell a piece of development. That show, Rescue 77, I think we only lasted 5 episodes. So this was at a time when it was primarily network television. You know, we were on, I think it was the UPN, like the Paramount network, but there weren't too many choices in terms of television at that time. So you're dealing with a network, and it was my first experience of being on a set and feeling the panic when a network executive shows up unannounced, which I then learned means that you're going to be canceled. Like at first you think, oh, how wonderful, they're coming to check up on your show. And then all of the more seasoned people are like, oh no, this is what this means, because they don't ever come to check up after a certain point, especially not like on the 5th episode. So we were canceled when the network executive showed up and everyone's like, oh, all right, we're canceled. So after that, I had an agent, and my agent was great in terms of like getting me onto my next gig.
At what point did you make the step to be a producer as well?
So on Rescue 77, I was a staff writer, and then I went on another show. I think I was a staff writer again on a show called Ryan Caulfield, which is a show about a 21-year-old rookie police officer. And that was another show, again, that lasted, I think we got canceled after maybe 7 or 8 episodes. At that point, I was able to get on a show called Any Day Now, which was more a character-driven show. It starred Annie Potts and Lorraine Toussaint as friends, 2 women who'd grown up together in Alabama during the civil rights movement. And it kind of followed their lives when they were little girls and also adult women. And we cut back and forth between their lives and their stories, and it was a great show. I was a story editor on that, and I stayed on that show for 2 years and made it into the co-producer ranks before Annie Potts decided that she wanted to stop acting for a while. I think that lasted for a year, and then she did another show. But because that show went down, I kind of ended it as a co-producer. And at that point, Eric Overmyer stepped back into my life. He'd met a gentleman who was doing a show about parole officers. There's a gentleman named Richard Stratton, who had been like America's biggest pot smuggler, had done was sentenced to 25 years in the federal pen for smuggling pot, and he found a loophole in his sentencing and got out. And of course, with that kind of background, the only place that will take you is Hollywood. So he was able to sell a show about his experiences being a parolee and being a pot smuggler. And he'd met with Eric looking for writers, and Eric was like, I have just the person for you about a show that includes a parole officer and his parolee. And so I met with Richard Stratton, and he ended up hiring me to be on this show called Street Time, which was a Showtime show that was like completely in my wheelhouse. It was so great. We got to tell a lot of my dad's stories, a lot of kind of parole stories that I don't think I would have ever been able to put anywhere else because they were so specific. And it was a really interesting experience for me as a young writer. It was a very small room. I think we had, there were only 4 of us in total. And I was the only writer kind of in the lower level producer range. Everybody else was an EP or a co-EP, but very seasoned writers. But they didn't have the same experience as I did having a parole officer for a father. And a lot of the show also dealt with the families of the parolee and the parole officer. So I had a ton of stories and kind of understood what it was like to be raised in a parole officer's house. And in terms of like building confidence and navigating that experience, it was interesting to be in the room with Richard and myself, and then these kind of TV writers who were used to writing cop shows, and they'd be like, okay, well, in this episode, we had a storyline where one of the parole officers had to kill a parolee in the line of duty. And the other writers were talking about how, we want to do a follow-up episode where the parole officer is kind of racked by guilt over having had to kill this parolee and how that affects him. And I remember Richard and I looked at each other and started laughing, and we're like, that's not how the parole officer feels. That's not how he feels. And we were kind of just talking about, from our experiences, what we knew would have been going on in the parole officer's head. It's like, it's him or me. Like, this is part of the job. He's not racked with guilt. He did what he had to do. And so it was interesting to be in a situation where even though I was a lower level writer, I had experiences that could make the show a bit more authentic. And that was another show where I met a writer, a wonderful writer named Clifton Campbell, who then became definitely another mentor to me and has hired me on other jobs. He was the creator and showrunner of a show called The Glades that he then hired me to work on because we had such a good experience working together on Street Time. So a lot of it is relationships. A lot of it for me is getting into a room and doing the job, but doing the job well, with integrity, knowing that you're mimicking somebody else's voice. You're there to make the showrunner's job easier. Your job is, as much as you want to infuse the stories with parts of yourself and tell your stories, which I definitely want to do, your main job is to execute the show and help the showrunner and get the voice of the show. So having learned that and having learned how to do that, that's always kind of kept me in good stead, because I feel like people value that I'm going to come on a show and really try to give them what they need and what they want, so that they're not constantly having to rewrite me, that they know that I'm going to try and hand in a script that's going to be as close to their voice as possible, as network ready as possible. And through that experience, I kind of started to develop a set of rules for myself about how to be in a room, what I wanted to be in terms of a writer. And I remember early on, just through observation and how I interacted on a staff, I came up with 3 rules that seemed to be the way that you had to comport yourself in a writer's room. One was, even if you didn't respect someone, you always had to be respectful, because I want to be respected, but even if I don't agree with someone, or I think, always treat people with respect. The second thing was to do every note. Even if I don't agree with a note, or I don't think a note's going to work, I have to try it and prove it. Like, execute the note. If it doesn't really work, then at least you can say, it doesn't work. I tried it. I really tried it. But then it might work. Find a way to make it work. So execute every note. And my last rule was more of a self-preservation one, which was the money always wins, which is, we're artists. We try to be good craftsmen. You want to write something that's artful, but at the end of the day, the Medici is paying for it, and the Medici is the studio and the network. And if they want something, you have to give it to them, because you'll get the note once and you might be like, I'm not gonna do that. And then you'll get the note again, and you'll get the note, and you'll get the note, and you'll get the note, until you execute the note or they fire you. So the money always wins. So, we're there to not only execute the vision of a creator of a show, but to provide a brand, to provide something that the network is buying. And you have to find a way to maintain your integrity, tell stories that you want to tell, but also give the people who are buying it what they want.
We're Amy and Nancy Harrington, and you're listening to the Passionistas Project podcast and our interview with Elle Johnson. Check out Elle's work on the TV series Bosch on Amazon.com. Now here's more of our conversation with Elle. What challenges do you feel like you've faced as a woman and as a Black woman in Hollywood?
My experience as a woman of color writing in Hollywood has been, the reason I get in the room is because they're looking for a woman of color. They are specifically looking to fill that quota. They either feel like there's a female character in the show, so they're like, oh, we need a woman's perspective. There's a minority character in the show, so they feel like they need that perspective, and I kind of click off a couple of boxes for them. That's the reason that I get the first job, usually. But then the reason that I get hired again by the same people is because I'm good. So I feel like that it in a weird way, it feels like, okay, maybe I'm being hired for something that seems like, well, it's limiting. But once I get in the door, it's like I realize that my responsibility is to prove that I can write the show and write it really well, and also bring a perspective that people might not have. I know some writers feel like, oh, you don't want to be that person in the room where you're always pitching the Black story or the gender story. And I feel the opposite way. I feel like that's my responsibility. Because nobody else is going to tell those stories. People are not, and I understand that to a degree. When you're in a room and it's predominantly white men, they're not thinking from that perspective. So I have to bring that perspective and always point out, hey, there's another way of looking at this situation, or, this character has no life. I've been in rooms where, you have kind of the Black female character. She's usually a lieutenant. An interesting thing kind of happens where you're on a show and they're staffing a show, and people will realize that they're not representing women, or they're not, they want to have a person of color, and that person is usually delegated to like the lieutenant or somebody who's not, they're on the periphery, they're in a high position, but you don't end up having to tell a lot of stories about them because they're not the main focus. I remember hearing someone joking about how if you watch television, you would think that every judge in America is a Black woman, because that's what they cast, because it's like, oh, right, we need to put a Black woman in here, or we need to put a person of color. So they stick them into a role that you really don't get to see the full life of that person. They're a mouthpiece, they have a position of power, but it's in terms of the story, it's not really ever the main focus of the story. So I've been in situations on shows where you have the lieutenant or, that one character where it's like you don't go home with them. They seem to have no life. It's almost as though they only exist in the gaze of the main lead character, who's usually a white man. And I feel like my job is to try to fill that character out. Like, what do they do when they go home? I've been on shows where I've said, if this character for our Christmas episode ends up having Christmas with the main character because they have no family or friends, I'm gonna slash my wrists. Like, this is completely ridiculous. This person has loved ones, they have friends, they have a life outside of this office. Please do not make them show up at somebody else's Christmas. Let's give them a life. Let's make a bigger story for them. So I feel like that is part of my job, to fill out the world of these other characters and say, there's more going on with them than just the job. Let's do for these characters as we do for all the other characters.
Do you have a mantra that you live by?
Over the years, I have had several mantras. It's really interesting that you ask that, because I'm a person who likes to make New Year's resolutions. So I love the holidays. I love December because I start to close out the year mentally and reflect on what I've done and start to think about what I'm going to do next year and project into the next year. And over the course of my career, particularly when I first started out, I would come up with these mantras that I'd be like, okay, this is the mantra for the year going forward. And I remember one of my earlier ones was, you know what you must do. It's inside of you for a reason. Don't deny yourself any longer. And I would say that to myself every day. Like, I'd wake up and be like, okay, you know what you must do. It's inside of you for a reason. Don't deny yourself any longer. And that's how I kind of got myself to be a writer. And one of my other mantras was, it had to do with, there's magic in the ether. You can do whatever you want and you're responsible for whatever you have or don't have. But I loved the idea of, sometimes you look at a situation, you look at like, how do I become a television writer? How do I do this? How do people do this? And for me, it was, there's magic in the ether. You just got to go for the magic. There's something out there. I don't know, I can't explain how it happens, but I'm going to believe that there's magic in the ether and I'm going to make it happen somehow. And right now, it's, December, I'm kind of trying to figure out what my mantra for the year going forward is. 2 years ago, my mantra was, this is the year that you're going to fail at everything. And I decided that I was just going to start swinging hard. I knew I was going to fail. Like, this is the year that you can make mistakes. You're going to fail. You're going to fall on your face. And it's okay, but you got to take those big swings, big risks for big rewards. So my mantra was, this is the year that you fail at everything. And I really approached it as like, just try and allow yourself to fail miserably and see what happens.
And how did it turn out?
It was great. That was the year when I believe I had like started pitching pilots for the first time, and I sold a pilot like my first time out. It was an amazing experience, but I was willing to fail. And that was also one of the things that someone had said to me early on in my career. When I first moved out to Los Angeles from New York, he said, you have to gamble Vegas style. You've picked something that, it's impossible. There's no reason why you should succeed at this. So you're already gambling. So if you're gonna gamble, don't do scratch offs. If you're gonna gamble, gamble all of it. Go all in, gamble Vegas style. And I was like, you're right. That's how you do it. Just go all in. There's no plan B. This is working. I'm putting everything on the table. And that mindset of like, this has to work, because what else am I going to do that works?
So in the journey so far, what do you consider the most courageous thing you did?
Moving out to LA. I'm a born and bred New Yorker, didn't learn to drive till I was 21. The idea of having to come to a city where I owned a car and car insurance, that alone was like, what? How do people do that? What is that? I don't understand that. There's no subway? How will I exist here? So the decision to leave my life in New York, which included a boyfriend who was a neurosurgeon, and African American. My mother wanted to kill me. Like, that relationship, I ended that relationship because I realized that wasn't my life. I had to try this. I had to come out to LA, and my parents were not supportive at all. They were like, you are insane. You're ruining your life. We're watching you ruin your life. And getting on a plane and coming out to sleep on somebody's couch with no job, and I'm like, I'm just going to get a day job and try and write.
Worked out okay.
Yeah, it worked out. It worked out. Yes.
Have you ever thought of quitting?
No. Once I started, it was like, I'm doing this. This is, I tell people young writers who are coming up, it's like, don't get out of line. Once you're in line, don't get out of line, because the person behind you is going to take your spot. You're going to move up. Just stay in line and keep doing what you're doing. You only fail when you stop trying. So just don't stop trying. You're still trying. You can still do it. Stay in line and keep doing what you're doing.
What's your secret to a rewarding life?
Secret to a rewarding life is finding a way somehow to do what I want to do, which is write. Finding a way to tell my stories. And within my career, early on, I realized that I had to learn craft, to get on shows that would challenge me, even if it wasn't exactly the type of show that I wanted to write, finding a way to express myself and to learn craft and really write well, so that now, 20 years in, I'm at a place where I kind of look around, and not that I can pick and choose, but that I can be more selective in terms of the things that I do. So, as I get older, just realizing I only had limited time, and what do you want to spend time doing? Taking shows that maybe have fewer episodes, but you love the material. This last year, I've been an executive producer on Bosch, which is a dream job, a show that I love. It's just writing about LA, writing about cops in LA, writing the Harry Bosch character, getting to work with Michael Connelly, who's in our room, is an amazing experience. And working with Eric Overmyer again, who was the showrunner who brought me on, it was an incredible experience. But I only did half a year this year so that I could work on another show, help develop another show about Madam C.J. Walker, she was the first African American millionaire in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and telling her story of how she created an empire of hair care products for Black women. It's just such an amazing story, and I had to do it. I really wanted to work on this show. The only way I could do it was if I spent half of my time on Bosch and the other half working on this show. So I was co-running it with a woman named Janine Sherman-Barrois, who runs a show called Claws. We were both in our writer's room. She was on Claws, I was on Bosch during the day. At 5 o'clock, we would meet and start a second writer's room to break the Madam CJ story. But we were both so passionate about this story, and the woman who created it, Nicole Jefferson Asher, was this incredible feature film, independent film writer. So the three of us were kind of like working on other projects full time and then coming together in the evenings to break the story because we wanted to. It's like, I want to do this. And that's what makes me happy, even though it was like, you're working until 10 o'clock at night doing 2 shows at the same time. But we were so passionate about the material, and that's what makes me happy, being able to work on stories, tell stories that I want to tell. And incredibly, like, having no time at all, somehow you figure out how to fit it all in because you have to tell these stories.
What's your definition of success?
My definition of success is being happy doing what you're doing, being satisfied and being able to pursue something that is of interest and value to you. That's my definition of success.
Thanks for listening to the Passionistas Project podcast and our interview with Elle Johnson. Check out Elle's work on the TV series Bosch on Amazon.com. And be sure to subscribe to the Passionistas Project podcast so you don't miss any of our upcoming inspiring guests.